Guys, this is one of the saddest days for Apple we have ever seen. Apple's brought out the harsh numbers, just the facts about their sales, and in the last quarter, that means the last 3 months, they only made $88.3 billion in revenue, which also happens to be a record high. Is Apple doomed? Nah. No, they're not. So yesterday, Apple announced all of the numbers, all of the harsh facts, like I said, about how much money they've made and how many of each product they've been selling and how well they've been selling. So I think the great thing about this new press release is it basically puts all of those iPhone X discontinuation rumors to rest because, no, I don't think Apple's going to discontinue their most top-selling iPhone that for the past 12 weeks has been #1. That's the big statistic that Tim Cook came forward with. He said every single week the iPhone X has been out, so that stretches all the way back to November. The iPhone X was the most top-sold iPhone. In fact, the most expensive iPhone we've ever seen, and yet it's the most top-selling one. So in terms of revenue, it's of course smart to compare the earnings Apple made of last year at this same time, right after the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus went on sale. So, in quarterly revenue, they made $88.3 billion. This is usually the kind of units you use for like government programs or countries, and yet it's Apple's revenue, which versus last year was $78.4 billion. That is up 13%. So despite all of the removal of the headphone jack, despite all the complaints that iPhones are never changing, iOS 11 is a joke, still results in a 13% raise. But of course, here's the one statistic you're going to hear about. Here's the one statistic all media outlets are going to generalize into a specific headline. iPhones sold 77.3 million units at the end of 2017 compared to 78.3 million, meaning that iPhones are down in sales by 1%. Now again, because this cycle of iPhones was way more expensive, especially with the iPhone X and all of the hype around that, it means that even though there was 1% less iPhones shipped, profit was still, like I said, much, much higher. So I often get into this debate with people about what companies are succeeding, but a lot of the times if you talk to tech people on YouTube, they like to refer to Apple as this like old abandoned company that doesn't know what's relevant anymore. Or I was watching the H3 podcast with MKBHD recently, and Ethan on there was like, is Apple not doing that well? I've heard that their sales were really disappointing. And if you're not looking at the harsh numbers, you probably would look at all of the headlines that people tweet out that say Apple had disappointing quarter, iPhone sales were worse, iPhones took a big dip in sales, and yet Apple's making more money regardless. So you can decide for yourself if that is a winning quarter or a losing quarter. I would say it's both, but in regards to Apple's success, this by no means is reference to Apple failing or Apple's gonna die, as many people on social media and in the YouTube comments like to tell me. Analysts are predicting Apple's about to fall down. They're about to lose everything. They're crashing. And the funny thing is that's not even new. People have been saying that ever since Apple's been around, and then if you look at the charts for revenue generated each quarter, it just keeps going up. And they keep breaking the records every single year. But what makes the good headlines? Apple's doomed. So I even brought this up yesterday. Google has more Android phones in the world than there are iPhones. So if you want to talk about sheer number of products sold, yes, there are way more Android devices than iOS devices. However, Google does not make a ton of money off of all that, and that's when yesterday Google announced their statistics, and they didn't want to talk about how many Pixel phones were sold. For some reason, that was left anonymous. All we really got from Google was that hardware shipments more than doubled from last year, which if you're like me, you're like, okay, so you're saying that the Google Home Mini sold a lot. It means the Pixel 2 did not sell very much. If there were a ton of Pixel 2s out there, Google would probably want to promote that and say, hey, look how many units we sold. But instead they said, we made $100 billion in all of last year, which by no means is a little amount of money. Google's doing fine. They're not gonna die. I just think it's interesting that the Google services company that's basically running the internet makes $100 billion in a year, and Apple makes $88 billion in 3 months. Just go to show you the different ideologies and what's important to them. People are willing to pay a lot more for good hardware than they are for AI. And again, these are just the statistics with my opinionated twist on them. So if you're curious for the other statistics, the iPads did actually have a slight increase in units shipped with 13.2 million. And sadly, but not surprisingly, the Macintosh had a downturn of 5%. But if you look at the charts on where Apple makes their money, Macs are definitely not a big priority to Apple anymore. And given there weren't a ton of Mac upgrades that most people were interested in that last quarter, other than the iMac Pro, unit shipments were definitely down. However, I'm sure profit for the number of people buying an iMac Pro probably was doing pretty good, as we saw with the overall quarter being the highest in Apple's history. Now, this means that in the US at least, the iPhone has has basically flown to the highest, most popular smartphone that you can buy. There's more people in the United States buying iPhones than ever. And what's interesting is it's kind of hard to find some of the statistics that other companies have for how their sales are doing. Like when it comes to the Galaxy Note series, while very impressive and technologically advanced, they're shipping single-digit units of that compared to the iPhones, which are measured in tens of millions. However, one statistic that is important to keep in mind is that last year when the iPhone 7 came out, 70 to 75% of all the iPhones bought were the iPhone 7. They were by far the most popular one. But now with this year, with the iPhone 8 and 10, they were closer to 60% of all the iPhones bought. So as we can see, high shipments of iPhones, but not all of them being the top of the line ones, not all of them being the iPhone 10 and 8. While they were definitely the most popular of them, they were no longer as big of a chunk. And I think that this is a problem that all companies are going to have to deal with. Something to keep in mind that I keep seeing in all these headlines is Apple had this growth despite the industry starting to shrink. As in overall, put all the companies together, less people are buying new smartphones every single year. This will be a growing issue as years go by because as companies make better phones, as companies make it easier for you to replace your battery and make it last longer, and they make phones that age pretty well, there's less and less reason to actually upgrade your phone because I still know a lot of people in my life who have an iPhone 6S and are like, this is fine. It's still working to this day, not too laggy, camera's great, and has enough storage, so why do I need a 7 or an 8 or a 10? As more and more people are buying iPhones every year, they might start to realize that, there's just a slightly better iPhone 10 in 2018. Do I really need to buy that? Or am I good with my first 2017 iPhone? Overall, I think this means that the industry is going to shrink a little bit because more and more people are going to be buying a new smartphone every 3 to 4 years instead of every 1 year or 2 years. There will just be no point to. It's just like the Galaxy S8 and the Galaxy S9. It's like good camera, but if that's all you're really gonna do, my S8 is fine. Big problem that's gonna be very interesting to see how companies handle and how they're gonna make features and design changes that get people excited to buy phones again and make them go, ooh, that looks good, I really want that. I'm curious to see how it's gonna work. And I personally think that as in the next decade, we're going to see bezels go away, notches go away, and all smartphones just become sheets of glass with displays on them. Design, camera quality, storage, all of that's going to start becoming so paralleled because cameras will be so good across all different platforms that there will barely be any differences between the Pixel camera, the iPhone camera, and the Samsung camera. All of them are going to be nearly identical, and then they're all gonna have wireless charging, they're all gonna have wireless headphones coming with them, good speakers, good water resistance. When all smartphones start to become more tied with hardware, there's really only gonna be one thing that separates them, and that's the OS that is running on them, and that's something Apple has exclusive access towards. iOS only runs on iPhones, but I think Google is realizing this, and that's why they're making the stock Android experience and a bunch of software features they've designed only available on the Pixel phone because they're realizing, one day it's not going to matter what phone you buy and everyone's going to have Android phones and everyone's just going to buy the cheap one because all hardware will be doing the same thing. But luckily, Apple has an ecosystem to protect it between watchOS, tvOS, macOS, and the iPad lineup. All of that is going to back up the iPhone, and I think that's why the ecosystem is so important to consider when we're looking at the long-term lastingness of Apple. Apple is not doomed, and they're going to be here for at least another 30 to 40 years, in my opinion, unless they make some really terrible mistakes. But of course, I could be wrong, so let me know what you think in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you in the next one.